Hey everyone, this is Nick, your instructor for Myth in U.S. Culture. And in this video, I want to provide a brief overview of Paul's introductory chapter to her book, The Myths That Made America. I just want to emphasize up front that I'm not going to be covering the chapter comprehensively, and therefore I think it's important that you complete the assigned reading before watching this lecture video. Here I'm just going to be covering some important concepts and ideas from the chapter that'll be especially useful for our evaluation of the prominent U.S. myths. But I won't be covering all the details, and so I think a combination of reading the assigned reading and then watching this video will give you a good sense of the topics we'll be covering in the course. All right, so we're going to, in this class, be talking about myths of U.S. culture. And to that extent, we're going to be engaged in what is called American Studies. American Studies is a interdisciplinary academic field. It's interdisciplinary in the sense that it makes use of, it employs the methods and strategies and insights of a variety of academic disciplines, including history, sociology, politics, political science, anthropology, literature. Probably we could add here philosophy. We use these insights, we use these methods and strategies to develop an account of Americanness or American culture, to underpin the essential features of Americanness. And I think also to ask critically, is there anything like an essential feature of Americanness, or are we just using a kind of mental construct or a conceptual construct to talk about the nation? So for the purposes of this course, we're going to be using the textbook, The Myths That Made America by Heike Paul. And in that textbook, myths are the major topic. Myths in particular as they relate to the production of what we call U.S. culture. So Paul is going to analyze a number of prominent, important American myths, though certainly not all of them. Here she gives us an initial count of what an American myth is. She says that they are popular and powerful narratives of U.S. American national beginnings, which have turned out to be anchors and key references in discourses of Americanness, past and present. So, it's a lot packed into this definition. I want to focus on the idea of myths being narratives. On this account, myths are stories that we tell about a particular topic, in this instance, American culture. And so we have to ask, are narratives true? Are narratives false? Do they need to be true? Do they need to be false? What role do myths play in the production of culture? That will be a major source of investigation for us as we move through the semester. And do myths need to be true in order to successfully convey culture? Or could they simply contain a kernel of truth? Or could they be false but nevertheless express some shared experience? So what kind of narratives are we specifically talking about? What kind of narratives are particularly useful for producing a culture? So here is a list of some prominent American myths, and here the goal is just to get a sense of the kinds of topics we'll be looking at. So Christopher Columbus and the Myth of Discovery, Pocahontas and the Myth of Transatlantic Love, Pilgrims and Puritans and the Myth of the Promised Land, American Independence and the Myth of Founding Fathers, the Myth of the Melting Pot, Agrarianism, Expansionism and the Myth of the American West, and the Myth of the Self-Made Man. These are all stories or narratives told about the American past, and they help to cement a particular vision of American culture. And so we need to ask, are these narratives true? Are they false? Do they represent our experience accurately? What role do they play in producing American culture? And I think an especially useful question is, who do they benefit? All right, so Paul undertakes a specific strategy for analyzing the prominent myths. And I want to highlight this method so you understand how each chapter of the textbook will function. So in the first part, she's going to provide a general explanation of the formation of the myth through a historical analysis. So this is about getting the basic details of the myth. Where did the myth come from? Why did it arise? What is it about? This will be a straightaway historical analysis of the story told, right? Next will be where the myth analysis really begins, because in the second part of her analysis, she'll try to provide an explanation of the role of each of the myths in the development of American identity, the development of American culture. So here she'll be providing an account of how the myth helps to produce a sense of Americanness, a sense of American culture, and therefore of a national identity. Next, she will review reinterpretations of each of these myths from the subnational perspective. So, pretty crucial to the textbook is the observation that the original formulations of these myths are from a particular perspective. They're often from the perspective of people who stand to benefit from the articulations of these myths. And they express the experience of these particular persons. So, a lot of the myths, for example, express the perspective of Puritans who viewed North America as a land that they were destined to conquer and own. And so we need, therefore, says Paul, to also interpret these myths from the subnational perspective, which is to say we need to interpret them from the perspective of other people who were living in the times of the creation of these myths, but played no role in their production. So people who were cast aside in the new American society. In this part of the analysis, we try to round out our view of the myth by seeing how other groups will view the narrative. And then finally, a review of the reinterpretations of each myth from the transnational perspective. So here the goal is to think about whether or not the nation state is itself the proper focal point, or instead, whether we should focus on America from the perspective of outsiders, from the perspective of people who immigrate here, or from the perspective of people who are dominated by America. So here, notions like the American Empire become relevant. So in steps 3 and 4, we become critical of the early formations of these American myths. And we turn from viewing them as sources of American exceptionalism to critiques of American culture. All right, so what do myths do, especially as it relates to U.S. culture? So the prominent myths that Paul looks at have historically functioned to establish a vision of America as a predestined entity, as a realization of God's will, let's say. And this, of course, imbues the early Americans with a kind of special status. So these myths do this by articulating specific narratives about the origins and significance of the nation and the persons who occupy it. So we get grand tales about the formation of the nation, of the discovery of the land, and of the conquering of the land. And we'll turn back to this in a minute. So, for example, the myth of the self-made man portrays the apparently exceptional person we label as American, which emphasizes the morality of hard work, discipline, perseverance, and duty. So in this myth, we get an image of a person who takes control of their lives by conquering the land, working the land, growing wealth, and being self-sufficient. This is one of the prominent visions of the early Americans. And this myth plays a crucial role in the kind of public cultural morality we have even today. We celebrate the hard work of the individual, right? And we punish the failures of the individual. American myths therefore play a crucial role in cementing American exceptionalism because it portrays the founding of the nation, the nature of the nation, and the people in the nation as exceptional in one way or another. So what is American exceptionalism then? So here we have a quote from Schaeffer. This is from the introductory chapter. American exceptionalism is the notion that the United States was created differently, developed differently, and thus has to be understood differently. So this is the view of America as being a special nation, one which perhaps learns from the mistakes of human civilizations past, and which embodies certain attributes which make it unique and more powerful, more potent, and therefore as potentially serving a role model for other nations. Thus, in the 2000s, after September 11th, we get from American culture this idea of nation building, where we go to war in order to instill democracies in places that don't yet have democracies, because after all, America is a democracy and America is special, so therefore other nations can improve by being more like us. So American exceptionalism will always therefore imply the superiority of America and Americans over other nations and people by conveying the uniqueness and predestination of America. And there are particular sources of American exceptionalism, and Paul covers these in the introduction. Religion, politics, and economics. These are each ways in which America can be conceived of as being an exceptional place, as an exceptional nation. All right, so American religious exceptionalism. Many of the early myths are saturated with religious language. So in prominent U.S. myths, America is portrayed as ordained by God. And so we get quotes like this: the first generation of New England settlers in their special destiny as God's chosen people. So conceiving the early Puritans as being chosen by God to form a kind of utopia, right? So living by a specific religious culture, and as a result of living by that culture, creating a new society that will realize God's vision. So here we should just emphasize, Puritanism was the prominent religion of the original settlers of British North America, which emphasized salvation and redemption, in which required observance of strict moral codes. Much of the effort of the early settlers is cast through this lens. So we see them as seeking salvation and redemption by creating a new place, by righting the wrongs of the past, and doing so by observing strict moral standards. This is going to continue to embed American culture with a sense of uniqueness and perhaps a special place in the world. American political exceptionalism. This gets us back to the idea of democracy and nation building. So in prominent U.S. myths, America is conceived of as the first nation and beginning the world over again. So here we have language of utopia. America is going to produce a new society with new political values, which will render citizens more free and equal, and therefore more capable of realizing God's ordained vision. So Tocqueville underscored the uniqueness of American democracy. So at the time, the formation of American democracy was thought to be unique and special, and he thought that it was only a matter of time before it would spread to other countries. So if you're in early America and powerful foreigners are describing your political system as exceptional, as unique, this is going to only enhance this sense that America is an exceptional place, a special place. So in these early accounts, American democracy is contrasted with feudal and aristocratic forms of repression. So feudalism being the idea that the feudal lord grants land to serfs in exchange for work. Aristocracy referring to the idea of powerful elites running nations. But in America, we get free individual citizens who make their own decisions and, in particular, determine the nature of their political society by voting. And then American economic exceptionalism. I think American economic exceptionalism is especially important to understand from the perspective of contemporary society. I think this is an enduring idea. So the economic dimension of American exceptionalism is intertwined with a conception of the American individual. So here we have an idea of the American individual, the self-made man, as being a special kind of person and being enabled by a unique kind of religious and political civil society. So here we get the idea of American individualism. This arises from the political autonomy that Americans thought they had, their perceived religious freedoms. And I say perceived here because although there is this notion that many of the people who came here to originally settle North America did so to be free of religious persecution, nevertheless, quite immediately, there was a new form of religious persecution. So we need to question whether or not there really was religious freedom. And also, and this is really important for this sense of economic exceptionalism, this sense of the North American land as ripe with opportunity for harvest and exploitation. It's from this idea of American land being ripe with opportunity that we get the somewhat quasi-sexual notion of the land as the virgin land and the settlers as being the preordained people to come and take the land. So American economic exceptionalism is therefore driven by free and equal self-made individuals who cultivate prosperity through hard work and innovation. So this is the idea, by giving these special people these political rights and the freedom to make decisions about how to spend their life, that they would cultivate the land, produce a civil society which is especially efficient and productive, and therefore will grow and become prosperous. All right, so next I want to cover the different eras and perspectives of American studies. And Paul does a really nice job of highlighting these different eras. I'm providing just really a brief summary of these different transitory periods. So, of course, scholars have always studied the nation from a variety of perspectives. So the second there was a nation, there was scholarly work on the United States. But the interdisciplinary field that we call American Studies today was founded in the 1940s at Harvard. And the first major work of American Studies was Henry Nash Smith's work, Virgin Land, American West as Symbol and Myth. So doubling back to this idea of the land as being ripe and ready for exploitation. So in Smith's work, he explores narratives about the American West as a land of untapped potential, ready to be discovered and developed by the predestined early North American settlers. So myth, in this sense, is the narrative about these predestined settlers venturing into the wilderness to conquer it, and to build a society within it, and to prosper from it. So an important detail about Smith's work is that he establishes the idea that myths may be false or otherwise unjustifiably idealistic. So Smith therefore concedes in the work that myths can play an important role in producing culture and in producing the identity of a nation, even if the myths aren't wholly true, even if they're exaggerated or aggrandized. So this idea of Americans being this special group of people here to conquer the land, even if it is exaggerated, it nevertheless plays this crucial role in producing a culture and producing identity. So then it becomes true for the people who believe it. I think this is a very common idea within American politics. The production of stories and myths that become part of our identity and therefore become real to us, even if we can, from the outside perspective, question them. I think that'll be an important part of our myth analysis. How do the myths produce identity for us? By producing a sort of quasi-real world for us, which from the outside might appear to be an exaggeration or even a falsehood. So there's this internal, external perspective, the objective, subjective perspective. All right, so the first era of American studies is called the Myth and Symbol School, and Nash, along with Perry Miller, founded this first era of American studies. It's called the Myth and Symbol School. It's a straightaway analysis of the myths and symbols that are prominent in American culture, and the connection with these notions and American exceptionalism. So how do these myths, how do these symbols play a role in producing a sense of America as an exceptional place? So in this early work, the Puritan Americans are characterized as predestined to master the North American land, to develop a novel form of government highlighted by enhanced civic and religious freedoms, and unleash the spirit of free market enterprise. So in the early American studies, we get elaborate, elegant accounts of why America is exceptional, playing up this idea of America as unique and world historic. That is to say, in the early myth and symbol school period of American studies, there isn't a challenging of the content of the myths. There is an articulation of the myths. There's a presentation of the myths. And it's only later that these myths then become challenged. That takes us to the critical myth and symbol school. So early critics of Miller and Smith observe that although they successfully characterize the myths, they do give us an account of how the myths have functioned to produce a sense of American exceptionalism. They nevertheless mostly affirm these attitudes. So they affirm the attitudes of the powerful, namely the largely Puritan class of citizens, while marginalizing the voices of the oppressed and the subjugated. Which is to say, missing from the analysis of the myths is how outsiders would view these myths. So there's other persons living either in North America, within the United States, within the early British colonies, or adjacent to these political institutions, which are not welcomed in, and for whom a voice at the table is not provided. So Miller and Smith mostly highlight the early American experience from the perspective of the Puritans and affirmed this perspective. So they basically celebrate it in a way. The critical myth and symbol school thereby try to do something different. They endeavor to highlight the subnational narratives of early American life. So by subnational, the critical myth school means those other groups that live within the nation but aren't represented by it. So here we have perspectives of Native Americans, slaves, and women who lack rights. Right? And it's from this perspective that maybe the vision of America as exceptional and predestined seems less plausible. Nevertheless, in the critical myth and symbol school, the goal is not to show that America isn't exceptional. It's just to round out that exceptional narrative. It still places America at the sort of like hierarchical pinnacle and wants to include more voices in that vision of America. But then we get the transnational perspective. And this is the third wave of American studies, the so-called New Americanists. They do praise the analysis of the critical myth and symbol school because, after all, the critical myth and symbol school highlight the incompleteness of the prominent U.S. myths. They highlight how these myths leave out the perspective of whole groups of people who have their own American experience. But they also note that the critical myth and symbol school still places America at the center of attention. The nation is still the focal point. So the transnational New Americanists, by contrast, question the prominence of the nation state itself. So the critical myth and symbol school did not thoroughly question the framework of the nation as the basic conceptual category of scholarship, and thus remained bound to the logic of national exceptionalism. In other words, in the critical myth and symbol school, or what we might call second wave American studies, the nation is still the prominent field of inquiry. And so this allows for a continued interpretation of America as being exceptional. The third wave of American studies draws our attention to the multicultural and multilingual aspects of American society and offers a critique of American empire. So it resituates America in the global context and sees America not necessarily as an exceptional nation, but one nation among the many, as containing one culture among the many. And this opens our vision to other potential places which might also, in their own ways, be great and exceptional. And it also undercovers the way that the traditional narrative of American exceptionalism allows for and justifies American domination of other parts of the world. So, for example, the way in which the American economic system has subjugated the agriculture of Latin American economies. It would be a critique of American exceptionalism. Now, I want to emphasize that as we move through the text, I won't necessarily be siding with any of these analyses. I think they can all be important. So in the first phase, we can uncover the ways in which the myths were formed and how they produced this narrative of America as a special place and as containing special people. And then in the second wave, we can see how there was a need to expand the vision, expand the horizon, and include other people who lived in America but did not have a voice. And then in the third wave, we can also think about America as a nation, and we can think about the prominent myths of American culture, not from the internal landscape of America, but from the external landscape. So think about how others view America and whether they agree with this idea of American exceptional stature.